Ah, all right. Thank you for those who have been patient with us. We are up and running again. It sounds like Councilman Henderson is on the line with us. Councilman Henderson, one last time, can you hear us? I think that was a yes. I'm going to assume that was a yes. So we are still in our public comment portion of our meeting. Once again, items for the Olympia Master Development Agreement will be handled during the proposed annexation of Olympia.
Hello, hello.
Thank you, Jared. We can't hear you. Appreciate that. We will take those here in just a moment. We were in the middle of discussing the Trail of Hope. We had gone through all members present that would like to speak, so I'm going to look to see if we have any electronic in regards to that specific item. Trail of Hope. Do you have any electronic for Trail of Hope? Okay, no. Okay. So are there any other items other than the Olympia Hills that anybody in the public would like to speak during public comment portion of our meeting? Seeing none. Are there any other electronic comments other than Olympia that we have currently? Okay, so I'll turn the time over to our city recorder to read those into the record.
We received a comment from a Christian Davies, and his comment is, "Where are the roads?"
Sorry, where are the roads? Okay, thank you. See no further public comment. We'll close the public comment portion of our meeting. We will move on to item 6, which is City Council Board and Committee reports.
I'll just quickly report on the Wasatch Front Waste and Recycling. We talked quite a bit in the work meeting about the police officers' compensation, and we're having the same trickle effect from Salt Lake City's raise in salaries and wages. It's affecting probably all industries, but we're having a difficult time retaining drivers because of it. Same deal. So we're having to do the same thing, look at salary adjustments and compensations and things like that. So, which again is affecting budgets and not just a hard time. That'll be what I'll say about that. But the good thing is recycling is coming down. We were paying sometimes upwards of like $60 a ton, and now we're down to about $5 a ton. So that's a good sign.
Good deal. Go ahead, Steve.
Couple quick comments. So I think Sherry, Clint, and Jared were all on that LPC call the other day, and it tied in with the Wasatch Front Regional Council Regional Growth Committee meeting that I had. And there was one item that came up that I think is really interesting for the public's consumption and for this council to consider, is that when they were talking about what are the policies that the Utah League of Cities and Towns and or the Regional Growth Committee, Wasatch Regional Council should be adopting or supporting in regards to housing affordability. And they were sorting through, I think it was 170 different policy proposals on how to deal with that. Some of them were reasonable and good, and some of them were less reasonable and not so good. But it's interesting just to see how many communities, how many people, how many different ideas there are about how to address it. And I didn't see one of them that was a solution, to be honest with you. They were all taking a swing at doing things that sounded good or made people feel good, but didn't have any data or support behind what it would actually accomplish. So there's government for you. One other thing I just wanted to update is from committee is the traffic committee, specifically as it relates to safe walking routes. That's been a very hot topic as school's gone back into session.
How is it?
Chief, I know this is your favorite subject, right? So I've heard some really kind of crazy comments, as if the city doesn't care about children's safety, or they only do things that look good on paper, or safe walking routes are ridiculous, or any number of things. Having never been a part of that process before, I was pretty ignorant of what goes into determining these safe walking routes. However, now being a part of the traffic committee, representing the council on that committee, and being a part of a discussion, several discussions about safe walking routes for children, it is mind-boggling the amount of effort and time, research, studies, traffic counts, input from public safety, input from schools, input from the school board, coordination of start and release times among schools, trying to figure out proper roads, how many crossing guards it requires. These are not willy-nilly decisions. These are well-considered, well-researched, well-thought-out decisions made by people who have a sincere concern for the safety of all of our children. My children walk to school too, so they're driving right now, but they just started a new school. So I have a concern about how my children get to and from school. So I just want everybody to know this is something that the city and all of the interested parties take very seriously. And it's frustrating to hear comments that people don't think that the city cares, because we really do. And that's at the foremost of all those decisions that we make. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate the comments, suggestions, ideas. They're all considered, but we can't put sidewalks everywhere. We can't put stoplights everywhere. So we have to try and figure out one great route that we can, or one best route that we can do. But ultimately, as parents, you have the opportunity to determine the method and direction that your children take to school. We highly recommend they take the safe walking route. But as parents, you guys have that determination. We ask you to use that discretion wisely and take your responsibility to get your children to and from school seriously. So thank you.
I'll be brief. I've got a couple of quick reports to give. Last week, ahead of the Utah League of Cities and Towns LPC meeting was the Board of Directors meeting. In there, just a couple of updates. One talked about the funding. They have hired a new staff position there that will help in the guidance and tracking of the American Rescue Plan funds. Again, the board as a whole decided to support a kind of a flat fee of each of the entities that belong to the league to the league to help fund this position, to help have one dedicated person that can really kind of be the go-to expert on ARPA funds. And so that most of the cities have paid that. There's still a few that haven't, but they do have that position on staff now that we can use as a resource. Secondarily, that they talked about the upcoming league conference, which will be the end of September. And in association with that, there are several board vacancies that need to be filled, with some people rotating off of the board. So again, those nominations are open, I believe, up until September, the first part of September. And I believe it's Mayor Ramsey that will be the chair overseeing that nomination. And there is an executive position open as well as the second vice president as well. But that list, if you need that list, let me know. I can forward you to see. You can see the vacancies that exist on that. There are a few on there, obviously, that are running for re-election and are desirous to continue to serve should they win their elections. And then the last thing from the league board meeting was they had Wayne Niederhauser, who is now the State Homeless Services Coordinator, that came in and talked to the board of directors about his new position and about some of the thoughts and actions that they're taking going forward to address homelessness. He had a ton of information, obviously, now that he has really had a chance to get into that role and spend some time with those people. And again, you know, we don't see a lot of homelessness in our community, but it doesn't mean that we can't be part of that solution. And so the league is continuing to work with them on how, you know, addressing homelessness is really a statewide effort and not just concentrated into those cities that have more of that population within them. And the three areas they really highlighted is Ogden, Salt Lake City, and St. George. Those are the three areas that have the largest population of those in that category, but we all need to be part of the solution in that. So that's the report from the board of directors. I think Steve, you kind of mentioned LPC a little bit. I don't know that there was a lot else of importance that came out of that. And then lastly, well, two others really quick. Met with on the UTA as part of the advisory council, sit on the audit committee for UTA. This is continued follow-up from the audit a couple years ago that highlighted many deficiencies, obviously, within the organization. And there's still a few things that they are continuing to finalize out. But I'm happy to report that really all of the major things have been addressed and rectified within that audit. And they are down really to just a couple of things that really are just kind of continuing and revolving things to make sure that their internal practices are continuing to be in check. And one of those is, that'll be an ongoing one, which was a major finding in their initial one, had to do with the replacement of some of their major capital, in particular their cars and their trains and those types of things, and the tracking of those. And they had honestly previously poor accountability of some of those large assets and tracking them through. And they've done a really good job in tightening up those. They have a really good internal audit team now that focuses heavily on those. And I have additional notes on that. If you have any questions on those, there's still a few requirements and things that they're doing internally to help bolster their internal SOPs in terms of their operators and the handling of money and those types of things. But again, the outside auditor is really pleased with the progress being made there. And then lastly, the sewer board meeting was held yesterday morning. Nothing of major significance there. Again, the thermal drying project continues to run well. They are still in the fine tunings of that process for it to meet the maximum specifications that the contract said that it would meet. So a few little tweaks to do that, but it is meeting the demand of the facility right now. So everything is going through the thermal dryer. And now we are working on a market study that goes through, again, we've had the product now classified as a Class A waste, which means it can go in any regular landfill. So right now, it is going to just the local landfill instead of having to go to a hazardous materials landfill, which is saving us a huge reduction in the poundage, as well as much closer travel and cheaper tipping fees. So it's saving us. However, the next phase of that is going through a market study to actually try and make this available and be able to actually potentially sell the product and the labeling. So that's the next phase. And again, it's when you look at the tonnage of waste that was coming out of there of the wet product before now compared to the waste, it is, again, it's an 8-to-1 reduction.
Clint, have they talked about a cost benefit analysis of when this machine will have paid for itself?
That is part of actually once they figure out the market analysis for the potential of selling the product, that's being figured into it because it could accelerate what that timeline is of the cost benefit. One of the major things that they were really faced with is the current landfill, which is actually located in where the hazardous waste was being hauled, is in West Valley. And actually West Valley has been in litigation with that, trying to close that for several years because it's in some proximity to homes and businesses and things there. And so the biggest fear really of the district ahead of getting the thermal drying project up online is that site would close, which would mean that our hauling would have to go significantly further, either to Tooele or the south end of Utah County, which are the closest, and significantly increase those costs of waste disposal. So we got ahead of that. We made it through getting this classified as a Class A waste. Again, it was a very expensive project. It was over a $40 million project. So it will take some time to recoup, but in the long run, and especially on the environmental side of things, hugely beneficial for the changes that have been made. Again, I would encourage any member of the council that wants to go down there and see that. I can obviously help make those calls and arrangements with Craig White down there. He'd love to show you. It's pretty fascinating what they're doing down there now. Just waste treatment in general is quite a fascinating process. So Kind of a dirty job though. And that's all I have to report. Thank you.
Nice and short.
Water meetings.
All right, we will move on. Councilman Henderson. Any items? Silence is going to be a no? Oh.
Nope.
Oh. All right,
Great,
we will
no,
move
that's
on
good.
to item 7.1, appointment of the proposed community facilitators and deputy facilitators. Sandra.
Thank you, Mayor. So as you know, our community outreach program has been in place since 2017, and we have held over 50 community meetings. As part of our policy for the community outreach program, we appoint our community facilitators every 2 years. So with that, I reached out to our current facilitators, spoke with each one of them to see if they were interested in continuing their volunteer as the facilitator for their community. Of them, 2 have requested to continue working with the program. I personally want to thank all of those that have been involved in this program, because without it, it wouldn't be as successful as it has been. So with that, we have 4 new volunteers for the program. And tonight we are requesting approval for the following 6 individuals. For our community 1, our facilitator is Michael O'Rourke. The deputy facilitator is Jennifer Johnson. Actually, Michael is here. For community 2, we have Preston Oberg as our facilitator. And then we move to community 5. Kyle Walton is our facilitator for that, community 5. And community 6, we have Matt Granato as our facilitator and Kevin Allred as our deputy facilitator. Any questions?
No, there's a lot of vacancies would be
There
my only
are.
question.
We've been receiving applications, but again, we recommend or request that if you have anyone else that you'd like to, for those areas, we're open.
Yeah, how are we recruiting them? Is there a way that we can assist you in recruiting people?
So we have worked with our communications department and pushing it out on our social media.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I thought I've seen a few more applications than people that are on here, so I'm assuming that we're just working through some of those.
We are.
Okay.
Any questions or discussion by this body?
I
Thank
just
you.
want to say thank you. Yeah. All the people who do that, it's awesome. That's hard work.
That sounds like you're almost ready to make a motion.
I could be if you're willing to.
I'm
accept
willing
one.
to accept one.
Motion to approve resolution R27-2021, consenting to the appointment of community facilitators.
Second, sorry.
Okay, motion and a second. Jared.
Yes.
Clint.
Yes.
Sherry.
Yes.
Steve.
Yes.
And I'll vote yes. That motion passes. Thank you very much for your support and participation. I think this is a fantastic program and has made, I know, the life of the Planning Commission much, much easier in the past several years. And we appreciate your participation.
Thank you very much.
We will move on to item 7.2, which is the Olympia Master Development Agreement discussion. Chase.
Thank you, Mayor. Destiny, can I just have you move those slides along rather than me coming and getting the clicker? I appreciate that.
Oh, come on.
So if you'll go to the first slide. And council, this item is just on this portion of the agenda, mostly just to inform you of where staff is at with regard to this item. But also just if you do have any additional recommendations for moving this item forward. I've made some recommendations, but we would always appreciate additional direction as we move forward on this particularly important item. So just for the public's consumption, this development agreement would cover the area indicated here in green on the map. That is the proposed Olympia development, and it is on for the annexation petition for that area is on for a public hearing tonight. If you'll go to the next slide, Destiny. Just briefly, this is the city's current general plan that covers the proposed area. Next slide. This is the proposed general plan that has been discussed by the Planning Commission. They held a public hearing. They've made a recommendation to the City Council, who heard that for the first time at the last meeting. And the discussion on that was to have an additional meeting to focus in on this a little bit more as a city council. But this is the proposed general plan that also includes some of the, or also includes all of the annexation area for Olympia. Next slide. This is the heat map or bubble map that was approved by Salt Lake County in connection with the county's development agreement for this area. It again just is illustrated here to depict what the county has approved. It is not necessarily what's being discussed in this development agreement with the city and the developer, but just for some context, it is there to indicate what the county has approved. Next slide. This final slide, and I'll have you just click through all of them. Stop. Yep, that's the last one. Thank you.
Go, stop.
So this is just a timeline of the statutory and more formal procedural items with relation to the drafting of this development agreement. The beginning of this development agreement actually goes back as far as April of this year, when council directed staff to convene working groups to meet with the developer and discuss details of a potential annexation and what a development agreement would look like with regard to that annexation. So there were multiple meetings with staff, council members present, and the developers team present to negotiate some of those items. Formally though, starting first on July 14th, the Harriman City Council voted to accept an annexation petition. That kind of started this annexation process off formally. And right after that meeting, on the very next day, the Planning Commission held a work session where they discussed some of the terms of the draft development agreement for this project. And that same night, the Planning Commission held a public hearing on the draft design guidelines. And the next formal meeting occurred on July 21st, when the Planning Commission convened a special work session where they met in the council workroom for a number of hours and discussed the details of the development agreement as well as the design guidelines. On August 5th, the Planning Commission held a public hearing on the full draft development agreement and design guidelines and made a recommendation to the City Council that night. On August 9th, the City Council convened a special, I think I have one more item on there, Destiny, sorry. Nope, I don't. This says City Council work meeting, but it was actually a special work meeting to discuss the master development agreement. That was 2 weeks ago. I apologize. I have the dates wrong.
10 days ago.
Yeah, it was 10 days ago. Thank you. It felt like 2 weeks ago. So I don't have that subsequent meeting on here, but there was a special meeting of the City Council 10 days ago to discuss the development agreement. And as you recall, we went through that section by section and itemized things that needed to be addressed, things that should be changed, some minor language that needed to be altered, and then really formulated what items the council felt were important to come back to and work on with the developer. I've summarized those items in my staff report. I hope you've had a chance to go through those. It wasn't my intention to go through those line by line tonight, but as I worked with the other staff members that were present that night, this was the list we came up with section by section of the items that the council had discussed that we intend as a staff to continue working on, subject to any additional direction from the council. That's all.
My only comment is it's a long list, and once you do that, then after you do that, we'll probably have a few more
Have another
things
one.
to
We're gonna have
add.
another
Yeah.
one list for you.
So again, the recommendation, the only recommendation I have is that we have obviously now council involved in this process. It's never been my practice just to go and negotiate without obviously that direction from staff. I view this as direction from staff, but I also don't want to necessarily miss an opportunity or misrepresent what it is that the council's intending to do. So if you have any additional direction about involvement that you would like to have in that process, or any additional meetings that you would like to reconvene to discuss these items, that direction
I know
would
you
be
want to have
useful.
more meetings.
You know, Chase, as I've been thinking about this, one of the things that I go back to when we set up our work groups, right, is that the idea of getting all the council together, going through another work meeting, trying to discuss each line item and how we might clarify or specify things. it starts to become a very truncated process, right? It takes, getting us all together isn't convenient all the time. It's not very easy all the time. It's not very productive sometimes. So what I'm going to recommend, and I don't know if this is motion or just consensus here, that we take that same kind of next step. I think that we need to get from the philosophical and kind of loose nature of some of these things to a more definitive, spelled out, fleshed out agreement so that the council has a chance to say, yes, no, yes, no, right? Rather than change this, change this, change this. We still don't have, the circuit hasn't been completed and come back to us with, okay, here's the changes we think you might have wanted to make. And then we give you feedback and it goes back again and back again. I don't find that a useful, a productive use of staff's time and a productive use of the council's time. So I would recommend that a couple of us, not a quorum, my recommendation would be, just because I know who's going to say who, I would say myself, Councilman Smith, engage with the developer, with staff to get out and take these things from this laundry list and actually get verbiage into an MDA so that we can come back as a council and get into it, right? There's so many, we need more specificity. We need to know what's going to happen here. We need to know what's going to happen here. And I think that we all have different ideas about what that might look like or what that might be.
Time to see it.
Yeah, I think we just got to see it, right? And to actually say, all right, here is a potential solution that we came up with. Here's the verbiage for it. Here's how it's been written out. Here's an idea. And then bring it back so as a whole council and as the public has a chance to actually get through specifics instead of, well, we're going to reference an exhibit that doesn't exist yet. Or we're going to fix this, but we haven't done it yet. I don't think that's acceptable to the council or to the public. So that would be my recommendation at this point, is that we just get into this and get it.
Don't we already have that committee set up?
Sorry, what?
Or don't we already have the MDA committee set up for that?
Clint and I are on the MDA committee, that's correct. Are you proposing that you would want to replace me on the MDA committee?
I'm not suggesting that. I think that, the MDA committee's been working on this since March.
No, we've had 2 meetings. We haven't been working on it. We had literally 2 meetings. The first one was, what are some of the things you guys think you want to see in this? And the other one was, here's a basic thing. No, there hasn't been any progress.
I'll just make a comment here quickly. And Steve, I think you make some good points. Obviously, I think everyone's anxious to figure out how we get to that next step.
Right.
We had our, we had our special council meeting and again, really came up with this list that you have here of the things that we needed more specificity or more clarification. And now we have to figure out how we get that language in a draft document for everybody to consider. And so you're heading down the same path of the question I was really going to ask, Chase, as after at the conclusion of his presentation. And that I think it's difficult for us as a council to try and put staff in a position to go and negotiate some of these critical issues. And the sense I got from your presentation and your staff report is that even though I think you're willing to do that, given some good direction, I think you would prefer really to have some engagement from the council in order to sit down and hash through that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. And if I could add to that just briefly, to Council Member Schild's point, it also isn't the most effective use of time from a staff's perspective or from council's perspective to say, we as staff spent 5 hours negotiating these points. bringing it back and saying, did we get it right?
Right.
Right. And then going back and forth and back and forth. The exercise that we had with the planning commission was actually very productive on one of these days, the 21st, where the developer and the counts and the planning commission were both engaged together, going back and forth and talking about ways to adjust some of that language. Whether that's a meeting with the full council or, just the working group meeting or 2 other members of council, from a staff perspective, would be very helpful.
And that's the first point I really wanted to clarify, to make sure I was understanding, I guess, kind of what you were presenting to us and looking for some of that direction. So again, to Steve's point, I'm very anxious to see us get to that next step where we fill in that language, where we have some of those more difficult or negotiatory conversations to help get some of those specifics in there. So I want to do what it takes to help get us to that next point. And I'm willing, obviously, to be part of that, whether it's Steve and myself, whether it's Sherry and myself on the
Let me clarify
MDA.
one point about that too, to answer Sherry's question, is that I guess my concern is that I'm not sure that an hour and a half or 2-hour committee meeting is going to be sufficient. That's
I
what
agree.
my concern is.
I agree.
That this is something that's going to take a huge amount of time. I have tentatively reached out to the developer, to staff, trying to say what kind of timeframes do we think this would take? When do we think we could do it? How long would it take? The biggest determinant in me asking for this or suggesting this is that there is a timeline that that the landowners and developers of Olympia Hills are trying to meet. They have expressed that should that timeline not work, that they would be inclined to pursue additional solutions. My feeling is I don't want to have to put us or them in a situation where we're trying to call a bluff, if that makes sense. I'm going to take them at their word and take us at our word. If that timeline is going to be met, this body and the public need to have a fleshed out MDA to look at by September 8th. That is an incredibly short period of time. Now we have a bunch of solutions that we came up with, but they're still not in there. And that is concerning to me, of how do we get from this to an MDA that actually is something tangible with exhibits and explanations and details and quantifiable gives and takes, and here's the benefits to the community and here's the specific amenities that are going to happen, all that kind of stuff between now and September 8th. So I think that's going to take just this big investment of time. I did reach out, like I said, I did reach out to staff. I reached out to the developer. There's tentatively a 4-hour meeting planned for tomorrow, and then another unknown amount of time planned for next week, just kind of placeholders set up so that there can be 4 hours tomorrow and then another 5, 6, 7, 8 hours on Tuesday next week to try and accomplish that goal. Now, I don't know if we can do it in that time. I don't know if it's going to be meaningful in that time. I just want to take a swing at it to try and see if there's a possibility that we can meet the timeline. And if we can't, we can't. But I feel like as a representative of the city, I want to do what I can to try and avoid a default, if that makes sense. I don't want to sit on the sidelines and then have it just go somewhere else by default. I'd rather make sure that we get in and give it our best to have an honest, reasonable conclusion and decision on this. So I guess that's the difference why I'm saying this as opposed to the MDA committee. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a whole different thing. That,
Right.
what you just talked about was setting up meetings that I was unaware of, right? So I understand that. I guess I'm confused because in my mind, when this direction was given, I would have expected this to already come back in a draft. that you represent us. And so I would have expected you to put this in an MDA and bring it back and say, does this represent what this council directed me to do? And then we take that document and then we use that document to negotiate with the other party, because that document is representative of the whole council. If we only have 2 members of the council in those negotiations, it doesn't really represent the whole council. Do you see what I'm saying? That concerns me, because you are a representative of the city and I 100% respect that. So am I. So is David, so is Clint, and so is Jared. That's why there's 5 of us sitting on this to negotiate those types of things. So I understand, I completely sympathize with what you're saying about this timeline. Same thing, same argument I've had about being super concerned about meeting an artificial timeline, because that's how things get screwed up, right? And I'm not suggesting that you would mess these up, but that's what happens is we get in these war rooms and then we make mistakes because we're trying to meet a timeline. I have 100% respect with what they are asking. And they're asking that because these seats will change in January, you know? And so they want to make sure that they get that done before that happens. But I do believe that if we're honestly moving forward with good intent and working through a good negotiation, then there should be no desire on the part of the developer to change that, as long as he feels like there's good consensus in the council. There will be 3 of us for sure that will see these things, maybe 4. So there's already that there for them to move forward. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know. I understand what you're saying, but those are my concerns with that.
And I get what you're saying, and I'm trying to
Sure.
articulate better is that it's not trying to say to go negotiate all the stuff, right?
No, I
Because that's
understand.
a council body
Sure.
decision,
To
right?
get it to that point.
I'm just trying to say, how do we get it from this
List of
frankly
perhaps.
insufficient
Mhm.
form to something that actually we can do something with, right?
Mhm.
And there's probably some things that we have on here that they're not excited about. And maybe we can come up and say, all right, here is a proposal that seems to go in line. I mean, we've heard each other's feedback. We kind of know what's going on. I'm not trying to go in and you know, I want to articulate all the reasonable things that have been said, you know, so we can make sure that those are being included, but perhaps come up with some specific language and solutions and bring it back so that as a council, we can go, that's a good solution. This is not yet good enough solution, right?
Sure.
And I guess that's the difference is it's not finalize the MDA, it's get a freaking MDA so that we can actually make a decision. Does that make sense?
If I can,
My frustration, if I may, my frustration, Steve, is that we should have that now. We had that special meeting. We took extra time, had a long meeting, gave direction to our attorney to draft an MDA, including those major items that we discussed. Why do we not have that tonight? That's what I expected to discuss tonight. This shouldn't be something that is nebulous, that a few people are talking about behind closed doors. That's business as usual. This body promised to do this differently, and what you're suggesting is heading down the same road that everything else has been done.
if I can make a quick comment, one back to Steve's timeline comment. Sherry, I completely respect, you know, this negotiation in good faith and those types of things. However, I think that we all came into this potential annexation process understanding that there was a desire by the developer. Even though and we've talked about a potential timeline all along from day one that led us to what their hope was, and that was of some type of a decision potentially in October to meet the timeline for a January 1 annexation to be effective. I don't think anyone here didn't understand that was the desire. And to Steve's point, I think that we have to continue to do everything that we can, because we entered that in good faith with them. We have to do everything we can to continue to do our best to vet this process out to try and meet that timeline. Maybe we get it done, maybe we don't.
And you know, there's really 3 processes, right? And they're kind of all being conflated into the same thing, because each one is kind of happens simultaneously, if you will. They don't have to necessarily, but one is there's an annexation petition, right? And there's a decision about whether or not we think it should be annexed. There's another part of this that is a development agreement, and that largely is going to determine the inputs that make the decision about the annexation meaningful or not, right?
Mhm.
The third part of that is that does the MDA that we're negotiating and the specifics of that MDA and the annexation merge with what we're talking about with the general plan changes, right? So there's a general plan, there's a development agreement, and there's an annexation, and we're kind of having all three conversations at once. And unfortunately, the MDA is the part that has kind of is the key linchpin in all of that.
Mhm.
And it's the one that is dragging behind the others right
Yep,
now, right?
agree.
And we can't really even move forward on the others with any specificity until this gets done.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to meet, an arbitrary deadline. There's a specific deadline, but again, I don't want it to pass by default. I want to give it my best effort.
Yeah.
And I agree, and I'll just go back to the points I've said in every meeting was that I never agreed to any artificial timeline. They simply submitted a petition for annexation. I 100% agreed to show up to the meetings that are scheduled, to give my input, to be prepared, give feedback, participate in it, participate in the process, and continue to go through the process. So I don't think it's in poor faith to just continue through the process.
I don't think it is either, but I also don't think that it's sufficient at this point.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And to, this list that's here, the itemized list of MDA matters to address, it's extensive from that first meeting. And honestly, I can't say whether I think because of how extensive it is and the feedback that was got that night, I see that there would have been really a lot of difficulty in Chase being able to put together something different to put before us tonight. The fact of the matter is, again, whether you think that there should have been or shouldn't, the fact of the matter is that there isn't tonight, and we're trying to figure out how to get to that step. And I want to do what it takes, put in the work, the effort, whatever that takes to get us to that next step, because as Steve just pointed out, this really is kind of the linchpin in everything. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of diving into the details, and whether we do it we get the confidence of the rest of the council to allow a couple of us to go in and at least build a framework to bring back for everybody to discuss. Certainly, if it's me, whether it's through the MDA or whether it's Steve and I, however it is, I wouldn't be going in there expecting that I'm making those final decisions. We're going in there to try and have these negotiations based on these points that we brought up that need further discussion to be able to try and get to a point to where we're both at least semi-comfortable with some language to put in there to then bring back to the full council to continue to vet out. And I think Steve's suggestion is reasonable to allow at least a couple of us, whoever that is, to continue to engage with the developer heavily in the next, short time frame in order to allow that to happen.
So to understand where everyone stands at this point, my understanding of the discussion we're having is we're looking to give direction to staff per the request. This direction that Steve is recommending that this body give is that we move forward with two members of the council, one being Steve, one being Clint, to work over the next week and a half to get this into a language that would allow us to review the specifics. Is that the direction, Steve, that you are giving, that you were recommending this body gives to staff?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question, Mayor. Clint, were you already available for those dates? For those times?
I have some tentative placeholders because, again, there's been nothing concrete decided. That's why we're discussing it right now.
Okay. So with regard to that specific direction, Sherry, are you in favor of giving that direction to staff?
No.
Okay, Clint, are you in favor of giving that direction to staff?
I am. I think it's important we keep this moving.
Okay, Jared, are you in favor of giving that direction to staff?
I am absolutely disgusted with what's going on. No.
Okay. So that leaves that decision to me, as it is a 50-50 split as of this point. I understand the concerns on both sides. I think that there is legitimate concerns from both sides, or both opinions that we are hearing and discussing. I do think that the timeline is not necessarily artificial. I do think that that timeline is a timeline that we have and we're trying to address. I also understand the concern and the feelings regarding what may appear from doing this in a way that's faster, not what someone feels is in the best interest of doing it, a different way. In my opinion, I think the direction I would recommend towards staff would be that we do move forward with the recommendation from Steve, with Steve and Clint working with staff to create a document that can be brought back to this body so that we can all review the specifics and move forward from there. So unless staff needs further direction in regards to that item, I'm looking both at attorney and our city manager.
If you're going to empower two staff or two counselors, I actually think you should do a motion and not just consensus. If that's what the body wants to do.
We are giving. It's my understanding that we are giving direction. We are not taking action on an item right now. Jackie, am I wrong on that, or what? We can make a motion. Okay. What? I'm open to a motion then, if that's the recommendation from our recorder.
Then I would restate my suggestion as a motion that we, I don't know if the word is appoint or direct staff and two members of council, Councilman Smith and myself, to engage in formalizing a final draft MDA for the public and council to review and make decisions on.
You sure you want to use the term formal draft, our final draft?
A formal draft.
Okay.
But in your previous thing, you mentioned with the developers.
Yes.
You need to include that
Sorry.
in your motion. Whoever's going to be on your committee.
Yes, with the developers, with staff. Yeah.
They have a motion.
How's that for a good motion?
It was rough. We got there though, I think.
Yeah.
I'll second your motion, Steve.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Steve?
Yes.
Sherry?
No.
Clint?
Yes.
Jared?
No.
And I will vote yes, that motion passes. We will move on to item 8.1, which is the public hearing relating to the proposed annexation petition, Olympia Land LLC. Jackie, this is in regards for the public, specifically to the annexation of the property, not to the development agreement.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Yeah, so this is a different aspect of the annexation process. This is strictly related to the petition to annex the proposed 933 acres into the city. Olympia Land LLC filed a petition for annexation on June 15th, 2021, after which the City Council decided to discuss that petition for further consideration. The petition was certified July 16th, 2021, and during the protest period, which started July 16th and ended August 16th, no protest had been filed. And so the next step in that process is to conduct a public hearing. And so I'm here to answer any questions about the proposed annexation, which a map is on your screens. If you have any questions related to that, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Again, this isn't about the development or the infrastructure itself. It's whether or not to bring
Simply
that.
whether or not the boundaries come into the city.
That's correct.
Okay. And any questions from this body in regards to the annexation proposal?
No, other than the ones I addressed previously, I felt like that I don't necessarily know that this was a proper time for the public hearing because obviously it's not going to annex into the city until the MDA is completed and until people are agreed to this. So in my opinion, it was premature to say this is a public hearing, because I believed it to have a proper public hearing. We should be giving our public the opportunity to understand the conditions under which this land was going to be annexed in, because although the annexation is simply just that process, there's no way that people are going to agree to allow this to come into the city without that MDA in place. So that's my concern.
If I could echo, Sherry, I completely agree with your concern. I think, a public hearing on the annexation is somewhat meaningless unless we know what that actually means, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is part of the reason why I know there's another tentative public meeting on the MDA scheduled for September 8th as part of the timeline that had been established. And that's part of the thing is, why would we have that meeting if we don't have something to talk about, right, with the public? And that's seeing that clock ticking is the motivation why I'm really pushing to get an MDA with exhibits and details and all of our recommendations and, enumerated and encapsulated in it, so that when we do have a public meeting, it's about something of material worth, right? Not because, again, I don't know that this meeting is going to be all that meaningful, right?
Yeah.
So.
If I may make a statement, I would recommend you leave this public hearing open
Sure.
and take the comments that we receive into this, and maybe they do make comments about the development itself, that the council members that are appointed to work on that MDA can take into consideration, as well as the rest of the council.
Thanks.
I don't anticipate this actually moving forward without that other process being completed. It's just following a timeline to try to get the public participation out there.
Hey, I'm all about having an extra opportunity, even if it's a little early, for the public to speak. So I'm happy, and I would have no problem if a member of this body recommended we continue it moving forward. With that being said, are there any questions in regards to the actual annexation before we open the public hearing? Okay, with that, I will open the public hearing portion of this meeting.
Can I ask, I do have one clarifying question. So the original proposal was 933 acres. With the little peninsula for that, the electric thing, whatever the power company thing, is it still 933
Yes,
acres? Is it
so
931?
They didn't bring it into the city, so that is staying in unincorporated Salt Lake County. And so that won't change the acreage. It's
So
not
it's
going
still
to be less.
933. If that would have come in,
Then it would have
gone
been
to
increased.
935. Okay,
Yes,
thank
and they
you.
would have had to start the process over.
Thank you.
Okay, we will begin with Justin Swain. Justin, if you want to come to the podium. Once again, the same rules apply. 2-minute timer on these. If you have questions, we may or may not be able to answer them, but we will do our best to take those into account as we make any possible decisions now or in the future. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor, council members. I appreciate the clarification because I wasn't exactly sure how to comment on the annexation without talking about the MDA, because as we've discussed, it's difficult to support an annexation without knowing under what conditions we're performing the annexation. So I would simply say that from a high level, I support and always have supported the idea of Olympia Hills, of master plan communities. We need houses, we need townhomes, we need condos, we need apartments, like we need everything. My concern is how often the end result is wildly different than the original plan. The plan looks great, fantastic. My level of trust that that's what we end up with, that's another story. For me personally, this has never really been focused on unit count. It's about unit count and the ability to sustain the unit count. So if the plan sustains it, that's great. I would ask that we do everything that we can in the MDA to include regulation that, I don't know if demand's the right word, supports that infrastructure to sustain it. And to me, if the developer is truly wanting to build, or the developers are truly wanting to build what they say they want to, that shouldn't be an issue. I know there were phases in the county plan, and I liked the idea of it, but the language to me seems to make it very difficult to actually enforce those phases. I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to agree to X amount of units, and then you have to have certain commercial space, certain infrastructure, public transit, whatever the list may be. Check those off, great, now you can move to phase 2. Let's just simply ask to supply what's being proposed in the plan in phases to make sure we don't end up with some of the developments that we already have where we have no ability to sustain the population and the growth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
All right, so that is the only form that I've received so far. If there's anybody else in the audience at this time that would like to speak to this item, please come up to the podium this time and do so. Start with your name, please.
I am also Jared, and yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me. Jared Usman. Look, I know this is a passionate thing, right? A lot of people fought against Olympia Hills, lost, it's coming. I know how that feels. I lost too, and that's okay, right? It's coming. If we don't have the annexation discussion, there's no point in the MDA discussion. It doesn't happen, right? One has to precede the other. You don't get a seat. You don't get to negotiate the MDA if you don't discuss the annexation. And while we're going to debate whether the annexation happens, right? Whether we annex them or not, they're coming, and so is the infrastructure necessary to sustain them. Well, guess what? If we don't have them, we're still on the foot for that bill for the infrastructure. And I love my neighbors, but I don't want to pay their water bill, and I don't want to pay to repave their driveway. So I support this, keep going with it. I have some really good negotiation tactics books if you want to borrow some. So just let me know. Wow, I'm going to give you 47 seconds back.
Wow,
Thanks, y'all.
appreciate it, Jared. Thank you.
Jared.
Hi, my name is Dan Adams. I live on 60th West on Fragrant Lane. One of my concerns about annexing a large swath of land is how the city currently manages our existing infrastructure. Every morning when I take my son to school, it's a 20-minute drive from where I live to get him to Mountain Ridge High School. I'm sitting between 56 West and Mountain View Corridor, and it's a parking lot. If we annex this land, what are we doing around infrastructure? Currently, we can't use 126 South. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's empty, but once that becomes available from Bangor Highway, there's really only 2 routes coming into Harriman. My concern is with the amount of housing that will go in there, will we be able to support the infrastructure that needs to be done there? I don't think we can. And I think that's something that we need to take into consideration. The other thing is around the whole discussion around Olympia Hills, it's been said there'll be a self-contained area. That is not true. Wherever you build, they always float out to use services elsewhere within the valley. If you believe that they're going to provide all the services that's there, that's false. When you look at development, housing comes in first, businesses come in second. We're still waiting for a lot of businesses here in Harriman. I've heard that we're getting more grocery stores that are coming in. I've been hearing that for the last 20 years. So it's hard to believe that Olympia Hills will do this when we're having that problem with messages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further from the audience, I will turn, I know we have some ones that have been sent electronically, so I'll turn to our recorder to read those into the record.
The first comment was submitted by Travis Watson. My family has lived in Harriman for 16 years and we've enjoyed it. One thing that Harriman needs is another large park. Butterfield Park is awesome, but for the size of Harriman and how many youth sports we have, especially with 2 high schools, we could use another sports field for rugby, football, baseball, etc., and maybe some pickleball courts. A water park area for younger kids would also be great. Please consider a good-sized park to keep up with the growth that has occurred. Comment received by Adrian Watson. We need more green space in Harriman. With all the growth, there is a problem with finding adequate space for all of our youth athletes. With the addition of Olympia Hills, that need is going to be much greater. We shouldn't have to go all the way up to Ogden or down to Provo when we have the potential to add more green space in our own community. Butterfield Park has not been adequate enough to host all of our youth athletes in the community. This is something that is greatly needed. A comment submitted by Brittany Parker. I'm all for this field being used for our kids' future and their future sports. I currently have 2 boys play in Harriman sports, high school for football and I think that's supposed to say rugby for both Little League. We pay a lot for rugby and fees for football to not have our field. With as many kids as we are trying to keep motivated and out of trouble, having somewhere close for them to walk, ride their bikes, scooters to practices. It is not easy trying to work Folsom and I'm guessing that's supposed to say work full time, and get kids to practices not in our city, our games, or to games for that matter. Kids strive to be in a great environment with coaches and friends to keep their home lives behind for a few hours. Please allow us as parents and taxpayers to have more room for the kids. Thank you for your time, and I hope it gets to where it needs to. Give kids and parents options. Comment submitted by Randy Stillman. This development is a lose-lose proposition for anyone currently living in Harriman. Even if the project is annexed, the impact on traffic will only add to the already ridiculous amount that isn't even accommodated currently within the current infrastructure. The statement in the flyer that Harriman will get over $100 million in one-time fee revenue to cover the $30 million cost that will be required for new infrastructure is not going to solve the immediate problem. The infrastructure needs to be fixed now before additional population is brought in. But we all know that's not how it works. And Harriman won't get the fees paid prior to the project. So like I said, it's a lose-lose for anyone currently living in Harriman. The housing developments are out of control in this city and giving our family a hard look at whether we want to stay. Comment submitted by Anthony Nelson. I am a Harriman resident in the Rosecrest area. In the information packet sent via USPS mail earlier this month, I read several times that the city and the developer are working on funding for infrastructure needs due to this new development. What I do not see is any mention of what is additional resources Salt Lake County is providing above and beyond whatever level they would normally provide. Given that the Salt Lake County Council approved this development and the city is doing its best to go through the process in the manner it should have been handled, I expect the county to provide financial resources to mitigate the negative impacts this development will have on our community. Thank you. A comment received from Robert Tazinski. Dear City Councilors, I have lived in Harriman for over 5 years. It is by far my favorite suburb of Salt Lake County and where I chose to build my home. I love the uniqueness of Harriman that sets it apart from any other SLC suburb. With that in mind, I find plans currently put out for building designs, particularly residential buildings, as mere copycats of Daybreak's designs. Nothing seems unique or particularly Harriman-like in these plans. I chose to live in Harriman because I have a particular distaste for the Daybreak area. Why would we copy Daybreak when we can build something completely unique to Harriman? Why not create something unique that will draw people to live in Harriman more than elsewhere? I think annexation is a great idea from tax revenue and infrastructure perspectives. Annexation seems like it ought to happen. But if we are to annex Olympia, we ought to seek to create something special, something uniquely Harriman, not just another carbon copy of the Daybreak community that many Harriman residents dislike. A comment submitted by Tanya Lofgren. I am in favor of the annexation of Olympia. It makes sense to have some benefit for all the impact it will have. Comment received by Paula Rosinski. I understand Olympia will exist at this point no matter what my opinion is. I'm not excited about the further congestion it will bring to 126 South and 134 South. I refuse to have to drive home between 4 and 7 p.m. with the traffic now as it raises my anxiety level. I love our location. I don't want to move. I don't know what can be done from Bangor West to help with the roads as there is nowhere to put them. It literally makes me cry if I have to drive between those hours. I don't feel it should take me 40 minutes to get 5 miles. When I lived in Chicago, unless I was downtown, this time was not acceptable. With approximately 7,000 new homes, that's at least 14,000 to 28,000 new cars. The other issue I have besides roads is infrastructure. Medical doctors and appointments in Salt Lake County are already taking up to 7 months. It was very hard to find doctors taking new patients when we moved to Harriman. Medical for all of Salt Lake County needs help. We need more than just new housing here. There is lots of infrastructure this south corridor needs before more expansion should take place. Harriman should not have any gridlock on roads. It is just unacceptable. A comment from David and Jan Ordway. If Olympia Hills is annexed, who is paying for the infrastructure? How will this be accomplished? Harriman's taxes are already the highest in the state. Now you are adding hundreds of percents to the taxes residents already pay. Does this mean more taxes will be added to the 400% plus that is proposed for Harriman residents? And the last comment was submitted by Felicia Walton. I am a citizen in favor of the Olympia Hills annexation.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. With that, I will accept a motion to hold, is that the right way to do this? Is to hold open the,
Just to continue.
just to continue the public hearing until our next meeting.
I would make a motion to continue the public hearing.
Okay.
Do we need that with a date? Or can we just continue it?
You can just continue it if you
Okay.
wish. Prefer.
I have a motion, a second. Clint,
Yes.
Sherry,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Jared. Jared, we didn't get something clear there. Can you give us your vote again, please?
Yes.
Thank you. And I will vote yes, that motion passes. We will move on to the consent agenda. I will accept a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I will motion that we approve the consent agenda as written.
Second.
I have a motion, a second. Sherry,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Jared,
Yes.
Clint.
Yes.
I vote that yes, that motion passes. Move on to item 10.1, discussion regarding encroachments on city property. Nathan.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, thank you for taking some time tonight. Look at, yes, you have it's not going to show up real well, so why don't we just zoom in on part of the southern part of the city here. This is a map that, as you'll see, you can see little red dots on it on your screen. It's probably hard for the audience. These are known encroachments onto city property or properties owned by the city without permission. Somebody has either extended a fence, landscaping, something into rights of way or other city properties. So as staff has looked at that, we're proposing a policy for you tonight. One, it will empower us to go out and enforce and have many of these encroachments removed, but it also provides a process for the city in the event that an encroachment makes sense. In my experience, sometimes that comes up with retaining walls or things like that, where there's a value to the city when somebody puts in a retaining wall because perhaps it holds back a slope off of a sidewalk or something. And while it technically is encroaching, that value comes, so the city would issue a temporary revocable permit, meaning if they had to expand the road or something, they could come back and and that individual would have to remove that encroachment. So you have before you tonight, again, is that policy. Now, as we were drafting my staff report, got finished, and then last week got really crazy. We came up with a numbering system after the fact. So the policy you're looking at tonight is, let me get this right, LP 82-001. What does that mean? Legislative policy, meaning it's adopted by council. 82 is is frankly the finance number we use for the divisions. And so if I'm engineering, so it's the 82 is how we define engineering. So that's the nomenclature that we're using. If it was an internal administrative, it would actually have an AP in front of it instead of LP. That wouldn't come to you, but we're trying to come to a spot where we formalize all these, keep them in a spot where the public can see them, where we know where they're at. Having been here for a short while, I use the phrase policy. This city uses standard operating procedures. And so I would ask for a policy that said, we don't have one. And then we do a little work and say, oh, we have this SOP. So we're trying to come up with a standardized nomenclature so I don't go crazy. And there is actually, in my mind, a difference between a procedure and a policy. So we're trying to separate those a little bit more fully. But again, these are existing encroachments. And I believe council saw this map prior to my arrival here. But the policy in front of you doesn't necessarily address each of these. These are enforcement issues. But as we go through these, there may be some where it makes sense to staff. And so we'll come back and recommend to you, and we'll go through that process. But this would give us a process to do that. So happy to answer questions. I know Chase has looked at it as well. So
I appreciate the work that's gone into developing this. We've talked about encroachments over and over and over again as a council, and some of the problems they present, and again, not having a clear process or policy of how to deal with those and how to enforce those. This is something that I think we've needed for a long time. And again, I appreciate all the work that's gone into it, because I think it will help clarify that process and help us to do better at identifying and dealing with the encroachments. And again, those that may have unique circumstances that in some cases may have some type of a benefit, and how we go about putting those in place and having the proper documentation to protect the city. So I appreciate the work that's gone into this, and am in favor of it.
The only question I had, Nathan, was it talks about you going through a process that talks about if you guys decide that granting a permit would be in the best interest of the city, then it comes to city council. What if you decide it won't? And is there a process for that resident still to petition the city council?
Certainly, they always have the right to, we would tell them we don't believe it meets, and then probably direct them to one of you, and then you could decide if you want to bring it back to the agenda.
Okay, that would be my only, but yeah, thank you for the work on this.
Any further discussion on this item?
I'm ready. Are you gonna make a comment, Steve? Go ahead.
Let me articulate this carefully. I don't want to dismiss individual responsibility of property owners to know their property boundaries and to act appropriately and to be respectful of other property lines. And I'm not trying to dismiss all that. I think there are some things that are done either in ignorance or in error. I guess I would just say, if there are areas where it might make sense to allow the encroachment to remain, even if it's not necessarily useful per se, because you use the term of, if somebody's retaining wall or something like that, that we try to find solutions that aren't going to create a huge cost for landowners and or the city to try and remedy if leaving something just is kind of a common sense thing, right? And I still think it needs to be addressed formally. We need to have a legally binding understanding of their occupation of that city property, right? But I think that those kinds of understanding would be a better solution than saying, look, you're on our land, you got to move everything, especially if it's, fence or a permanent structure. If it's, into a floodplain, okay, we understand there has to be a move, and let's figure out how we can assist making those things happen. But I'm just concerned that there's going to be a real negative impact on a lot of residents of the city. And I'm not saying that it's not unreasonable to expect people to respect those boundaries, but that I would like to try and find amiable solutions rather than demands and forcefulness if it can be avoided. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think part of it is covered when it just says, will it harm the city? It's
Yeah.
like, if it won't harm the city, then we can maybe look at ways of continuing.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it, right? If it's not harming or hurting anything, let's tidy it up with a formal agreement. But I prefer to.
So
not have to cost a lot of residents money.
I'm supportive of the fact that I don't want to put a excessive burden on our residents. I would just be hesitant in the idea of not being very consistent in this process across the board.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest concern with that request. And so I'm fine with if a resident wants to come in and say, hey, what can we do? How can we do it? I think that any request like that probably really should come to this council, simply so that staff doesn't get put in the awkward position of doing anything other than being consistent across the board and letting us handle that particular direction. Because I really just don't want to have staff needs to go out and be consistent. And if we start doing anything other than that.
And I would say I want this body to be consistent too.
Yeah.
Right. But I think one of the criteria, and I think it's spelled out in the policy, right? One of the criteria is it doing any harm? Is it a public safety issue? Is it does it make maintenance more problematic for the city? Does it encroach on a flood area, right? Or something like that? Does it impede public access on a trail, right? Those are things that are legitimate concerns we need to try and remedy. If it's 2 feet of public right of, public road that has no benefit to the city, it's not being used by the city, it doesn't harm anything, there's no problem, we can find a way to keep that. Right?
So my issue there is if somebody has put up a fence somewhere and we don't make them take it down, and there's another place where we do make them take it down, we now have an issue.
Well,
and that's my
we're
concern.
Just being arbitrary, but if we have a specific criteria that says if it is causing harm and one isn't causing harm, if we say there's harm to the city and this needs to be removed, that's not an arbitrary decision. And there's a difference in the precedent.
So for me, a taking of any property is a harm to the city.
And I can understand. I completely understand that, and I'm not suggesting it's not, but I think that there's ways we can come to.
I'm fine with that
solution.
What I don't want is I don't want to put staff in that situation, because staff and that's my biggest concern. We can be consistent one way or another. I just don't want staff to feel that they have to make that determination, because staff is the one that has to go out and be consistent. And if there is something that's different and outside of what we're asking staff to do in a policy, really that needs to come to us and we need to vet that out as a body.
Well, I think if I'm reading this policy right, what we would be authorizing staff to do here is to make a determination. No, this doesn't appear to be in compliance with the criteria we've established. And so we have to say no, but you have an opportunity to pursue this with the council for further consideration. Or they can say, yes, we think it does meet what we want to do, and there's a compelling interest why it should be. Then we're also empowering them to create a written findings articulating what the benefit and why they believe it's in the best interest, right? So the city is making a determination there.
But that determination just still comes to us for our approval. Am I incorrect there?
That was the, so if we say, yes, go ahead and issue it, then we would come to you and say you should issue it. Now,
So either way, anything other than they're removing their encroachment has to come to this body.
That's the way, if in the denial, they choose to come here.
Yes.
If we're recommending it, we will bring it to you. If we say no, you need to
They can
remove it.
choose to come
It's
to
up to
us.
them.
But regardless, the only way to get approval outside, or the only way to get approval to remain encroachment is to come to this body.
Correct. And you can always revisit that if there become a bunch, we may come to a point where you say, here are some better criteria. But
Now that we've hashed out a few of these, we have a better idea of what those criteria are.
And I'm supportive of that. Again, we can talk all day about encroachments and the variations of those we see. I do have, even if somebody knowingly encroaches on our property and puts a permanent structure there, but yet it's not doing any harm to the city, I still have an issue with that. I still have an issue with the fact that they made a decision on their own saying, the city's not using it, therefore I can, and I'm going to put some type of a permanent structure here. Those are things that, again, I think absolutely need to come back to this body to be able to review for that consistency. Because again, the term of doing no harm to the city, again, can be interpreted very differently.
And I think
Yeah.
that's a very fair statement.
I get what you're trying to do.
I do
Yeah,
too.
and
I'm supportive.
I guess the question would be, if there is a situation where it was, a knowingly, let's use the scenario you just outlined. For example, they know it's city property, but they say city's not using it, so I'm going to go ahead and put my shed there, right? Well, that's a problem. Is there now I feel like I'm talking about amnesty, but is there some kind of like fine that can be issued or something that would, penalize them that doesn't necessarily mean total removal of something? I guess I don't want to encourage people to encroach and say, I'll just pay the fine and that'll be fine, right?
And that's the problem.
But at the same time, my worry is you're going to go to somebody and their fence is a foot off of the property line by accident, and we're going to say, no, you got to spend $3,000 on a new vinyl fence because it's a foot over. It's of little consequence.
And that would be a situation where if that was truly a concern, that needs to come to this body so we hash out, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's why it needs to come back to this body so that we can hash that kind of stuff out, because that's not, and that goes back to the point, this is not staff's job to hash it out, it's ours,
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
So, which is why it needs to come back to this body so that we can hash it out.
Fair enough.
Ready for a motion?
I am ready for a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve resolution R30-2021, adopting city council policy LP-082-011, governing the issuance of revocable encroachment permits.
Second.
The motion is second. Steve?
Just on one point of correction, it's LP 082-001. Clint said 0.
Did I misstate?
He
Sorry.
said 1, so just make sure.
Thank you.
But yes.
Do you modify, or do you still support the modified?
Yeah, I'll amend my motion to make sure it's the right number.
You still second?
Yes.
Okay. Sherry,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Jared,
Yes.
Clint?
Yes.
I'll vote yes, that motion passes. 10.2, discussion consideration of a resolution approving a franchise agreement for telecommunication services with First Digital Telecom. Chase?
The city recently received a request by First Digital Telecom to enter into a franchise agreement for the installation of fiber and other telecommunication services within the city rights of way. As we discussed earlier, this is something that's happening, right? A lot of more fiber companies are looking at the growth in Harriman and finding ways to get their services out here. State code and our own city ordinance requires that they enter into a franchise agreement if they're going to install within the city's right of way. Part of that franchise agreement, and again, this is all dictated by city or state code, is that any franchisee that enters into an agreement for the installation of telecommunication services pay to the city a 3.5% tax on their gross receipts from those services. Some of the other relevant portions of this agreement are that it's non-exclusive, so it doesn't prohibit other service providers from coming in and using the same right of way for the same service. One other item is that this doesn't grant them carte blanche authority to also do so. They have to come in and still apply for a land disturbance permit with the engineering department, work on traffic mitigation, things of that nature that would come with the installation of such services within the city's right of way. The form that we have used is the exact same as the other franchise agreements for telecommunication services that the city council has approved recently. The only exception being the insurance requirements on page A, or on Exhibit A. They are the same insurance requirements that we have required with the other form agreements. It's simply that this provider requested that they be supplemented in an exhibit rather than in the body of the language. I didn't have any conditions or any concerns with that from a legal perspective. Like I said, it covers and indemnifies the city in the same manner as the other telecommunications franchise agreements that we've entered into. I brought this to you just straight for discussion and action because, again, it's very similar to the other items that we've considered in this scope. And it is largely dictated by state statute and our city ordinance about what is required to be in the agreements and what cannot be in the agreements.
Okay, any discussion regarding this item?
I will add one more item. This particular provider has actually contracted with a builder and is planning on providing telecommunication services to Hidden Oaks. So they do have a plan to come in and install. They have an area where they're planning on installing. And again, this isn't a reason for making the decision, but they would hope to expand from that area if they are granted the franchise agreement.
If there's no discussion, I would accept a motion.
Make a motion to approve resolution R28-2021, approving a franchise agreement with First Digital Telecom LLC for telecommunication services in Harriman City.
Second.
Motion is second. Jared?
Yes.
Clint?
Yes.
Sherry?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
I vote yes, that motion passes. That carries us to item 10.3. This is the request to support an interfaith day of service, designating a portion of Midas Creek Trail as the Trail of Hope and waiting fees for Crane Park for special concert. This is what many of the people that spoke during a public comment were referring to. Nathan?
Mr. Mayor, members of council. You've already heard some public comment on this and the staff report. There are 3 specific items in there, and I'll touch on each of those briefly. You can then act on them together or separate, trying to figure out how to bring this to you. And I will say that a lot of this is still in flux. It's still moving around. The trail piece, however, is not. So why don't I start there? The map in front of you shows the Midas Creek Trail, essentially from the high school down to Anthem. And it's this portion of the trail they are looking to designate as a Trail of Hope. And so a couple things to think about that with the signage. Once you allow a private group to put up signs, you have to allow other groups to put up signs. And sometimes the messages would be benign. Other times the community may not appreciate those signs. There's some very famous cases on the First Amendment and the rights. If you remember the parade in Illinois, right? If you allow anybody to take a parade, then you have to allow, in that case, it was a neo-Nazi group to have a parade. The city could not prohibit. So in talking with this group, that's a concern. How do we support something that I think is important without opening up a can of worms later? So one option would be for city's going to designate the area. We could also then put up the signs. Now, if we do that with volunteers, signs that are provided to us, they would still be city signs. And that would be my recommendation if you want to support that, is that the city retain, assume ownership of those signs. Those are our signs. If they get damaged, there's probably maintenance on us. But if somebody else comes and says, I want to do that, you still get to decide if you want to erect the signs. And I looked to Chase to make sure that covers us, but that's my concern. It has nothing really to do with the messaging. I think there's been some concern that that was addressed by the public comment, that this is a very sensitive issue for a lot of people. And I think probably all of us know somebody who has chosen to take their own life. And so I think I've never met anybody who would be opposed to stopping that. If I do, I will probably avoid them. But I think that would be my suggestion to you on how to deal with the signs if you choose to support that. The second issue, and this one is still in flux, they're looking to do a concert as part of this with Alex Boyer, and there's potential that could be at Crane Park. They're also looking at some others, and that's actually part of the discussion you could have. If they didn't use Crane Park, they may want to use some other facility, and they wanted us to potentially sign and sponsor that at Harriman, or it's Mountain Ridge High School. So that is up in there. And then the third, well, actually there were three things and we removed one. It was in regards to banners, but there wasn't enough time to get banners together and those things. So really those two issues are what are before you tonight. Are you interested in, and if they, in designating this trail and then allowing, within our capacity, allowing them to use Crane Park? There's a $175 fee that we usually assess, and they've asked that we waive that if we were to do it there. And then I guess kind of a tangential issue to that is if they choose not to do Crane Park, is the city willing to sign a lease for them? Essentially what that does is put our liability insurance so they can use that facility. So there's not a cost. We checked with our insurance company unless we have a claim. I'm happy to answer questions if I hopefully haven't confused the issue more.
And you can clarify again, Chase, when I spoke with you, you would not recommend, if it was not in a Harriman City facility, to sponsor it at an outside location, correct?
Yes, that was my advice. Yes.
Okay.
And maybe just quickly clarify, it's an unreasonable and unnecessary risk to assume. Obviously, you have to weigh that against the benefit of the item that you're insuring here, and that's the decision for the council to make.
Right. And the reason I want to bring that up too is because we do have a facility that would accommodate it without having to go to Mountain Ridge, which is a non-city facility. So we have a facility that could accommodate, and so we could sponsor there, and we're good with our insurance. All those things are not a concern after that if we just simply utilize the facility that we have, correct?
Already covered under our current policy if it's in a city venue.
And that, besides Crane Park, are there any other venues that would be appropriate for said that we have that would be appropriate? Why are we looking at Mountain Ridge and not Crane Park? Is there an issue? Is it weather? What's the concern?
Nathan can speak to that.
I believe the group was concerned that Crane Park might not be big enough. It's our largest venue, the way we can accommodate people there. There were some comments earlier about our parks are very heavily utilized. Butterfield Park is very heavily utilized at this time of year with the sports, and so there's not an option to do anything at that facility. So again, trying to find, and I believe we've done some concerts at Crane Park before, and so that was the suggestion that we made to the group.
And the other thing too was that they had anticipated a much larger audience at first, and that's why they were thinking Mountain Ridge. But just due to different realities of the numbers that they anticipate, now they believe that Crane Park would facilitate the amount of people that would be participating.
I don't have any problem with Crane Park. I would probably rely on the advice of the attorney to not sponsor something that's not a city
Facility.
Like, I'm totally fine waiving the fee. Doesn't bother me at all. Happy to do it. I think Crane Park's a great place to do it. And I think this is a absolutely worthwhile thing. Putting our liability on a facility that's not ours doesn't seem to be in the best interest of the public, even though we all are fully supportive of what this is trying to accomplish.
Just a couple of quick comments here, having kind of been at least on the very front end of this initial request coming to the city, and obviously figuring out a process to put that through. I think there was some view that maybe the city wasn't supportive of this, and that is not the case. I think every one of us up here are wholly supportive of the concept and the idea, but at least I'll speak for myself. My job is to make sure that I look out for the best interests of the city and how that extends to all of the residents in doing so. And so we wanted to make sure that we just went through a appropriate process to identify all of the potential challenges with the request and how then have the discussions of how we feel like we can best mitigate those. Because I think we've all been in favor of trying to find a way to mitigate those to allow this type of a project to move forward. I'm supportive really of both items that has been talked about. The signs, doing it in such a way that basically they're donated and we maintain ownership of those. But what I will say is that I hope that what was expressed to us that tonight in terms of some of the comments that were made is that that through donations of time and potentially other monetary donations via the high school, Harriman High School, that commented that, again, there's help in recognizing that the city is found a way to allow this to move forward that we think protects our interests moving forward, from opening ourselves up to other liabilities, but that we really do want to see this be a partnership between us and the community to continue to maintain it and make it what it's designed and hoped to be in a message of hope for our youth and our community. I think we all want that. And I'll just follow that up with saying that I'm supportive of waiving a fee for the concert as long as it's at a city facility.
So I'll just comment on the, I agree with the Crane Park, and I'm supportive of waiving the fee also. I think that would be a great venue for that concert. The Trail of Hope signs, one thing I know for sure about government is if there's a good idea, there'll be some sort of bureaucratic reason not to do it. So every time I think, oh, that sounds awesome, and then I come and ask somebody at staff, they'll say, well, what about this and what about this? There's always so many things. So I appreciate that there is a pathway forward to do that. I think I spoke about this in the meeting. Suicide is a terrible thing that affects a lot of people. But there are many, many ways to lose people. I have a friend who lost a son to a drug addiction. He doesn't know where he's at. He's still living on this planet, but he's lost to him. So there's so many things, so many ways people can become lost. So I truly hope that the Trail of Hope is a focus on hope. It's not a focus on suicide. And I believe that that's the intent behind it, is that we just have to make sure people understand what the signs say. Hey, you are important. There's great things ahead, those types of things. I can't remember every thing on the sign, but it's so important that we just focus on those things, that each individual is just valued. And so, and to stay focused on that. So I'm supportive of it also to move forward with those types of messages. I loved what he said about just live and have hope.
So I do have a question for possibly Chase. Would having a 503C that these signs could be donated to help protect the city in regards to future cases?
Not necessarily, because they're on city property, right? The ownership of the signs is an important element, but the more important one is where they're located, right? When we're discussing.
And that's my question. I know we keep throwing that around and keep kind of talking about that. I'm just wondering if this would be a reason that would help protect the city in a way that would allow this to occur, but not set us up for a precedent that causes us problem. And if you're saying we don't need that, that's fine. Jared, did you have any comments? That is a no. If there's no further discussion on this one, I'm happy to accept a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'll be happy to make a motion to approve the request to support an interfaith day of service and require the group to donate signs so they can be installed at the city's direction and waive the fee associated with Crane Park for a special concert.
I'll second that motion.
Motion a second. Clint?
Yes.
Sherry?
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Jared? We have lost Councilman Henderson's audio.
Can you type in can you type in the chat?
No, that would.
State requires that if a council member is participating virtually, that they be able to be heard in
Yeah,
order
be
to
heard.
participate.
So just so that the audience is aware, if we are unable to get communication back from Councilman Henderson, his vote automatically becomes a no. It is not that I think he in any way, and other than anything, supports this, but it is an automatic per policy and per the way our body works. So please do not indicate that as anything other than this body supports this.
And technical difficulties.
And technical difficulties. So it seems as Councilman Henderson has turned off his audio on his end, if he can hear us. We will allow
He was switching because I think it sounded like he might have been on a mobile phone.
We will allow another brief moment.
I just wanted to double check the state code on this because I know there've been a lot of changes. It does say that they can participate verbally or electronically.
Ooh.
So if he can chat in,
If
even
he can
that
chat
would
in,
be,
we'll take
that
it.
would be appropriate.
That's good. Thank you.
Another meeting, so that's why I was curious.
It was a recent change. Wanted to make sure.
Thank you. I appreciate the assistance. We will allow another 60 seconds or until 9:50. If we aren't able to get an answer in the next 2 minutes, we will be forced to move on.
Just ask them how do we vote.
Is saying off.
We should probably keep going. If he's no longer participating on that, does it count as a no vote? Or if he's just no longer at the meeting, does it
So
count like he's
he
no
was
longer at the
participating during as far as we can tell, he was participating at the discussion. So it is part of, it would be considered a no vote because he was, as far as we were
Be an
aware, he was,
abstain.
it would be an abstain. Not that we think in anything other than he
Or
is
would it be a
supportive.
not present?
No.
It would be an abstain at that point, or is it a no? Well, either way, it records as a no.
I don't know that we know for sure whether or not he was participating in the beginning of the discussion. I would rather just say he was not present for the vote.
Then for what it's worth, I would move that we just conclude the
Continue,
vote and move
yeah.
forward.
I have not, we are in the middle of the vote. You can't make another motion. However, it is now 9:50, so I'm going to move forward with no response from Councilman Henderson, and we'll say that our attorney will work with our recorder to make sure that we record that appropriately based on whatever their opinion is. And I will vote yes, so that motion passes. All right, we will move on to item 10.4, discussion consideration of resolution approving a master development agreement policy. Chase.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So this item is back on your agenda after some robust discussion at our last meeting. Just to clarify a few items here. Again, the purpose of this policy is to direct, for the council to direct staff how to handle applications or requests for a development agreement within the city. The last discussion that we had on this item, the council provided some direction for staff, or myself actually, to update this development agreement policy to include just a few things. I'll go over those items just briefly with you to make sure that I captured them according to your direction. You'll see in your packet that the changes to these items are in either red or blue, depending on how that came through, starting with section 2.2, and that just identifies the scope of the policy. The takeaway from my direction from council was that this should apply to all development agreements. However, the council may waive this requirement of this the requirements of this policy for development that's smaller than 5 acres in size. Again, I believe the idea in the discussion was that we want to have something in place for all development agreements. But if there's something that's just so small, I think Blake mentioned last meeting, there was a development agreement for a 2-lot subdivision, right? That would provide the council an opportunity and an opportunity for staff to request that these requirements be waived. The next change you'll see are in section 2.3 and 2.4. There was some discussion that we should implement working groups into this policy as well, similar to what we've done with the Olympia development agreement discussion. So section 2.4 establishes the requirement for those working groups and requires that there be relevant city staff, such as the engineering department, planning, legal, public safety, et cetera, that make up those working groups, and that they work with the city attorney, myself, to negotiate and formalize those items that are indicated in this policy to bring back to city council for review. Essentially what that creates and what the discussion was is that now we have relevant city staff giving their input and providing input on the draft agreement that comes to council for their discussion. So we don't have to take that back to those departments for additional review after the council has
Just a
seen
point of clarification, item 2.4, it's suggesting that the community development director is going to recommend the number of membership of the working groups at the next available meeting. So we're just going to say that after an MDA has been approved, those working groups will dissolve until such time as another MDA comes in. Is that how we're saying that?
That's how I intended it to be, was a
Okay.
case-by-case basis. Obviously open to feedback on that.
Totally fine with that. Just wanted to clarify.
And I think that's a good point, because we obviously have the scope of development agreements can range from 1,000-acre development to
2
10
lots.
to 100 to 2 lots, right? And the scope of who might need to be involved in those could vary. Section 2.5 talks about the provisions that are required to be in a development agreement for staff to bring to council. 2.5.4 talks about the loss of units for any use that is related to a church or a school that replaces any form of residential units. So we were just trying to shore up that language to identify that if they're replacing residential units with one of those uses, they lose the net density for those replaced uses.
One thing about this too, and I think it kind of covers it in 255 here, right? Is this if a commercial piece that's part of a development agreement were to be sold to a church or a charter school or something, or the school district that has trump over that zoning area, we wouldn't want to see a reduction in the amount of commercial that was committed as part of the agreement. So are you satisfied that this 255 language satisfies that expectation? That's what I'm not 100% sure of.
So like, for example, the Teton Ranch one where we had all that commercial and then they sold it to the charter school, but we never got a reduction in any, we never got a continuous commercial somewhere else in that
Right.
development. You're wanting to protect and make sure that if we say there's 50 acres of commercial in this MDA, there's 50 acres. And if you sell 25 of it to school, you better find that 25 somewhere else. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that especially if it's, I mean, OH is a little different, but if there's other places where it's not under the master plan zone, right, but it's overlaid over our existing zoning, if they have a commitment for 50 acres of commercial and their development only covers 50 acres of commercial, but they sell a portion off, they're still required to provide that commercial. How can they do it without the zoning, right? We're gonna have to change zoning on something else to accommodate the commercial that their requirements they need to have. So I guess the idea is we just want, you know, somebody brought that up in the comments is, I think it was Justin who said, we like the concepts, we just want to make sure that what is presented as the concept is actually what's get executed. And residential units are never sacrificed. Commercial space is sacrificed. Open space is sacrificed, right? Other things get sacrificed part of the agreements, but it's never the residential units.
Well, it's never the units. It might be the space. It's not.
Yeah, it's not the units, but yeah. And so I don't want to increase density by doing that. So that's why I proposed that the 254 where we eliminate the units. But I also want to say that if there's an amenity of a certain size acreage, they should have to do that. If there's a percentage of it that's commercial, they should have to stick with that. If there's I just don't like the idea that there's a commitment for a commercial
And then they sell it.
then they sell it to a school or to a church, and then we don't get any commercial. And the land that we had zoned for a particular use that was part of a development agreement is gone.
So I think my answer here, and I'm going to lean on Michael a little bit here as well, is that this would be covered by what's a permitted use within those areas, because we can, under a development agreement, zone something C2. And if that's a permitted use in that area, then the issue is not with whether it replaces something, it's a whether we are allowing it to be in there in the first
So
place.
the question specifically then goes back to the charter school, right? Because the charter school doesn't have to follow that.
That's
So if
correct.
a charter school comes in, like we've had happen, where you're getting 20 acres of commercial, oh, never mind, charter school, they're taking all of it, you get no commercial. Like, how do we protect ourselves?
Especially when it's a prime commercial, right? Like,
And the way you would do that would be to have a provision in your development agreement that says you are to construct 50 acres or whatever, right? Just using an arbitrary number of commercial space, and you cannot count certain uses towards that.
well, and that's why I
Commercial space.
wanted, that's why I'm curious as to the language of this. We have some specific language about the residential units and the requirement there.
Right.
I'm not sure that this 255 language is
It
sufficient.
does not do that.
Okay,
It does not capture what you are,
I don't think
what you're
so.
including.
So I don't want to delay this or belabor this. Maybe we can,
You can make,
subject to a correction here,
yeah,
right?
you could include that in your motion. That's an easy change.
Yeah, but I would like to see something that encompasses that feeling. So I think we're all in agreement that that's an issue with these things. And if that's going to be a requirement of development agreement, we want to make sure that that's put into the policy.
That's a wise comment, Steve. I really appreciate you bringing that to the table.
I'm
Yeah, I think that's spot
glad
on.
to do that myself there.
And my recommendation on
Thanks,
that
Michael,
for your
appreciate it.
motion would just, I think, would just say that there be a provision determining how much commercial space be developed within a project, within an MDA.
Yeah.
True commercial space.
That is still required even if the property is sold to another.
But like I say, I think it's
Well,
encompassed, the
any
intent
other
is
zone
encompassed with that
restriction.
simple language. You shore that up with the language in the MDA.
Yeah.
Only, it can't just be commercial because it was also talked a little bit about like a regional park or something like
All
that,
those
right?
things,
Any of those types.
Yeah,
You
I-
said strictly non-residential. If it's zoned, if it's can be a non-residential use that's set apart for a non-residential use, you still have to do that same amount.
Okay.
Yep. I don't
So
know how to say
basically,
that.
what we are saying is if they're gonna sell it, like, they can sell it wherever they want, but that acreage has to come out of the residential allotment. That's really what we're trying to say, right?
But here's the problem, right? And I guess if they sell it out of their residential allotment, a church or school still trumps zoning, right? So we wouldn't have to rezone it to put the church.
But they would lose the residential
But
allotment.
that's covered in 2.5.4. where they would lose their
Am I
residential.
right in that though? A church or school trumps all zoning or just trumps commercial zoning?
You can restrict areas where churches go.
But
So
not
our
schools.
churches are not allowed in C2 zone.
We just
currently,
have
for
to
example.
treat them equally as
Correct.
any other institutional
Right,
use.
right.
But not schools.
Not
Schools can
schools.
go wherever they want.
But we can contractually obligate them to not sell it to a school.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
Because this is a contract.
Right,
This
if it's in the
isn't,
MDA contract and they're required to provide 20 acres of commercial and there's no other commercial spot, they can't really sell that to anything that's not
Because we're contractually obligating them. We're not going around state law. We're saying you can choose to enter into an MDA, which is a contract, or you can choose not to. And maybe that's something you choose not to do and then you're going to subdivision.
I mean, this is a theory practice that
Right.
Michael would be better at speaking to is, does that though then create communities where we don't foster schools, right? Where we might otherwise want one.
If I might, I think one of the things we could do, so we're gonna come up with a policy that says, here's general guidelines. And I think that's what we've covered. When you're negotiating that, I think that's where you look at and say, okay, if you believe they're going to be civic uses, and that's, I'll lump those all together as a civic use, then designate those as part of the MDA. We think we're gonna, and we're seeing that actually with Olympia Hills, we're gonna sell 100 acres to the school district. Okay, you're telling us that up front. I would expect him,
So it doesn't-
part of this MDA, if you're gonna sell it to, how many acres are you gonna put in for civic uses?
Yeah, then that
Be
doesn't count in your
Schools,
open
churches.
Good point.
all that.
I think Nathan makes a good point. That would actually be
Yeah.
easy to draft in this policy, is saying there be a provision within a development agreement that establishes the acreage of civic, religious, commercial, and any other uses, right?
Any
that
other
you-
institutional use.
Yeah, that you want to identify.
Okay. That's a lot easier.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. The next change you see is in section 2.5.8 regarding the term of the agreement. The changes you'll see are that there be a preference for shorter terms with options to renew upon achieved benchmarks.
Yes.
And those benchmarks are talked about here in 2.5.11. I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. We identify a phasing plan that establishes those benchmarks, timeframes for completing those benchmarks and hitting those benchmarks. And then if you go down to the bottom of that section, a provision that states that the city will withhold building permits or some other, that's the easiest, not punishment, but that's the easiest remedy and enforcement measure that you can do to make sure that those benchmarks are reached. is to
Could I
withhold
ask for
building
one
permits.
additional clarification on here too? Is in the very last line of that 2511, it says, until the commercial spaces are developed. I think we've had a thing that it could be for the specified, the specified percentages or amenities are developed, right? It's not just the commercial space. It could be.
Yeah, I did
Park,
limit
it could
that
be something.
language, and I think you're right. I think it should say until those benchmarks, established benchmarks are reached, right? Because this provision is stating we're going to identify what those are. The enforcement measures, we will withhold building permits until those benchmarks
Until
are
those
reached.
benchmarks, yeah. Whatever those, we determine those are, okay.
And then going back to section 2.5.10, identifying what the benefits and the value are to the public of entering into a development agreement, spelling those out likely in the recitals of the development agreement. So those were the changes. I think the discussions we've had here are helpful, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Just say again, I like the process that we've been through to formulate this policy, to give us, again, some direction, staff direction, everyone, of what the expectation is of once we go through an MDA process, and help to make that a little bit clearer as we recognize that, over the years and a lot of different development agreements where components of this have been missed or not clear enough to really protect the city long term. So again, I think it's just another positive step forward to help protect the city long term.
I agree, which is a far, far better thing we do than we have ever done. I like this a lot. It's a good policy. I think it commemorates so many of the things that we have been trying or begging for fixes. And now we get to enumerate them and memorialize them as a formal policy. It's a very rewarding moment to see that.
I'm open to a motion to either continue or to approve with the recommended changes.
So I'll look for some clarity on how we would do this, but I would make a motion to approve resolution R29-201, adopting policy LP-085-001, outlining the procedure for processing master development agreement requests subject to the specific corrections and alterations that we discussed this evening.
Okay with that, Jackie? Okay.
I'm not really either.
I'm not.
I don't know.
A recommended addition to that motion would be just to call out the specific section. The ones that I have identified are section 2.5.5, identifying the specific civic, religious, institutional, and commercial uses. within the project, and then section 2.5.11 that the city withhold building permits until the benchmarks are reached.
I would amend my motion to include those two sections, 2.5.5 and 2.5.11.
I think I rubbed off on you, Steve, because I think you missed a number when you read it too. I think you said 2021 or 201 instead of 2021. So
I will
it's been a long
amend it to
night.
say Resolution R29-2021. So I have a motion with two amendments now.
I will second.
I'm looking for Jackie to make sure that everything's kosher. All right, I have a
That's very
motion
sloppily done.
and a second. Sherry,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Clint,
Yes.
and I will vote yes, that motion passes. We will move forward to item 10.5, discussion consideration of ordinance authorizing a text amendment to adopt language to enable large project master plan communities. Chase.
Thank you. And I'll be brief on this one. This has been an item that's been discussed at length with the council. It is a proposal to amend Title 10 of the Harriman City Code to allow for large project master plan communities to be worked out with the city, essentially what this tool allows. And I'll just have Destiny just go through each one of these slides really quickly, as you've seen them multitude of times, and I'll just reiterate some of them for the public's consumption. What this tool would allow, you'll just have to keep clicking. Yep, there you go. Would be a tool that would allow an owner of land, would allow an owner of land with at least 200 acres of contiguous property to apply to use this tool to create essentially a new zone that accounts for some of the difficulties that might be present in larger master plan communities. This process was initiated by the Planning Commission on May 6th, and they did hold a public hearing on this amendment. They did have one comment to reduce the acreage threshold from 400 acres down to 200 acres, which this council has talked about at length. And I believe the consensus on that item was to set that minimum acreage threshold at 200 acres.
With that, Chase, I do have one question. In the text of the Title 10 that's attached, under section 10.33-3, says the owner's contiguous agent property, accumulation property, large area in excess of 400 contiguous acres in size.
That was a change from the old text. So the motion would just need to include
The 200.
the 200 acres.
Okay.
Yep. And we'll update the text specifically once that is included in the motion.
We just want to make sure that we have all sorts of changes to the motion.
We're making you earn your money tonight. We apologize for that.
I think I know how to do this time.
If you'll keep going forward here, Destiny. Keep going to the next slide. So again, here are just our existing city zones. You can just plow through these. This would be a special district or zone within the city and would fall under here once an application is made. Keep going, Destiny. Thank you.
Don't stop, just keep
Yeah,
going.
and you can go through this one.
If he can't keep up,
I apologize.
that's his,
Go to the next slide. Again, how it works is the owner would make the application. The code sets forth what the application needs to include. It needs to include the name of the subzone, a map of the property, identify what the permitted conditional and accessory uses are, as well as a proposed development agreement. The development agreement needs to include all of these items. And then one of the minor changes we made was the items that are included in the MDA policy that the council just passed. So that was the reason why we held off on deciding on this item until we had approved that MDA policy. So you'll go to the next slide, Destiny. Again, this identifies the procedures for implementing this tool once it's approved, once the city council and the planning commission once the planning commission's made the recommendation and the city council has approved a subzone using this tool, the idea that the majority of it would be administratively enforced and implemented, much like any other zone within the city. And again, here are the areas within the current city boundaries where this would apply. And we have also highlighted the proposed Olympia annexation area where this would apply. Areas, again, over 200 acres would be the minimum threshold requirement. But this, again, just paints the picture of where those could possibly be used.
Essentially 2 plus Olympia Hills and things outside the city.
Right, and like we discussed last week, or at the last meeting, the Laguna Malibu could be developed in 5 different ways, right? Given the total acreage there, but you're correct, it likely would be just a few areas within the city.
This could also be applied to further areas that are in our designated annexation plan.
Correct.
It could be applied out there too.
Correct. Any other questions for me?
Nope. Do you need a motion, Mayor?
I'm open to a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve ordinance number 2021-22, amending Title 10 of the Harriman City Code to include Chapter 33 regarding large project master plan community tool. With the addition that it needs to be 200 acres, not 400 on the language.
Second.
Motion is second. Steve?
Yes.
Clint?
Yes.
Sherry?
Yes.
And I'll vote yes, that motion passes. 10.6, discussion to review modifications to Title 12 of the floodplain ordinance. I knew we were going to get through here at some point and see Jonathan's wonderful, wonderful face.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Council. Let's see, really quick. So what we'd like to do is chat just a little bit. There we go. I want to talk about just a little bit. Got it. I want to talk about the reason why I'm here tonight, and even look at just briefly the changes to the map. And that's the floodplain maps, and then any questions or discussion that the council would like to have. So back a little while back in 2019, FEMA went back and revised some small portions, to be candid, within Harriman City, specific to the floodplains. And that's again with Midas Creek, Wood Hollow, and Wood Hollow 2. Now, as part of that, there's some requirements in the ordinance, requirements by FEMA to be updated in our floodplain ordinance as part of this modification. And so they'll include, these modifications will allow us to be in compliance with the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. And so that's what this effort is all about. So really quick, what I want to do is just zoom. There's 2 areas mainly that have been adjusted in the floodplain. The first one on the north end up by Copper Creek, through Copper Creek rather, if you zoom into these, largely the changes are very incidental and small. The blue is how it exists today. And then when effective in November 19th, I believe, it would become purple, as shown in that exhibit. For the most part, is actually a little bit of an adjustment underneath Mountain View Corridor to follow the actual terrain of the channel. And then there's some small incidental modifications within or downstream of that area that do not, to the best of our estimation, change what has already been adversely affected with property owners. And this even more so.
Does it in a positive way impact any property owners?
Yeah.
Yes, and this next one here it does, and really there's no additional negative. I would add that iteration, but certainly to your point, there are some positive changes. Wood Hollow, you can see in the blue, it's the north channel on this one. You can see in blue is quite wide now. It's quite skinny. Now, I would say maybe I might have been wrong on this last one, where they have actually added a specific unnamed tributary. They're calling it Wood Hollow South. You can see did not exist before, and now it does.
That's on the map, not that it didn't exist.
That's true. Mother Nature had it there a long time, right? So now it's going to be identified by FEMA. And it follows a quite incised channel that has been there for a long time. Now it has been identified, and those property owners that are affected have been notified, and no comments were made. All right, so I did not plan on going through item by item in the changes to Title 12, so I thought I would just mention a few key items here. There are key additions. For the most part, we've added definitions, we've bolstered the ordinance, and the key additions to this, again, and I might iterate, the verbiage was suggested via the state from FEMA on what verbiage should be included in the ordinance. And we went through and placed them in as appropriate where we might have holes or some needs to be bolstered. Now, mostly there's definitions, but I'll tell you that some key additions were including the statutory authorization. It's essentially Harriman City declaring their membership with the NFIP. There were some compliance requirements that were added, as well as a authorization for a stop work order, as well as some added provisions in crawl spaces that fall within FEMA floodplains. And those are the essential key additions to the ordinance. So really the question for the council right now is, how would you like me to proceed? In the next meeting, would you like either we could bring in a liaison from the state to explain this a little bit more, to add some additional insight if there's any additional questions, or would the council prefer I move forward in a general meeting? The third option, of course, was we don't make any changes to the ordinance, but would risk our membership with the NFIP. Anyway, so that's the question for council right now. And any other questions that you might have?
So to be honest, I'm not an expert when it comes to floodplains. That's why we have fantastic staff. I appreciate the recommendation from staff. I appreciate you keeping me informed, but I think I fairly well understand the changes that are being made, and I am comfortable with them coming back to us as a body forward, as long as that recommendation is coming from staff. My thoughts.
Ditto.
All right. Thank you.
Any further discussions on that?
Nope, I think bring it
Okay,
back.
awesome. Do you need any further direction from us? That's what I like to hear. Good. All right, with that, we come to the end of our general agenda. Next meeting, September 2nd, is Planning Commission at 7 p.m. Excuse me.
It chokes me up sometimes too when I talk about the planning commission.
September 8th is our next city council work meeting at 5:30, and our general meeting is at 7 p.m. We do, as always, have our Hungry Harriman food truck roundup on Mondays. So August 30th at 5 p.m. as well as the farmers market we have, which is kind of awesome. So you should totally go to it. The only other item that we have moving forward is a closed session. So in a moment, I'll accept a motion to go into closed session. When we come out, there will be no further business. So we will not be restarting the broadcast at that point. So I will accept a motion to go into closed session.
Motion to temporarily recess the city council meeting to convene in closed session for the purpose to discuss pending or reasonable imminent litigation and the purchase, exchange, or lease of real property as provided by Utah Code Annotated Section 52-4-205.
Second,
Motion a second, Sherry.
yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Clint?
Yes.
I vote yes, that motion passes. We are into closed session.